Good morning again, and continuing meditations on progress. That could have been a silly title because I think when I talk about progress, a lot of people think in terms of politics and political progress. Now, I must confess that I have no faith in politicians who call themselves progressive. When people as disparate as Tony Blair and Jerry Adams and Jeremy Corbyn and Emmanuel Macron can all call themselves progressive, you realise it doesn't mean much. They're progressing in all sorts of directions. Now, my model for this progress is the churches of the first 3 centuries. Those 300 years or so from Jesus ascending to heaven to the church becoming part of the establishment. Those 300 years, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of documentation from them. One of the problems with church history is that it deals with documents, and so those first 300 years are underrepresented in most books of church history, but they were, I think, the most important years. Certainly in the late Roman Empire, people looked back on those days as being the times of the church's finest hours. But they were largely invisible people. To use Jesus' own metaphor, they were the yeast that gradually penetrated through the dough. The pagan writers complained about them more. They complained these Christians were cropping up all over the place. And they were accused of terrible things. First of all, they were called atheists, because everywhere the pagan temples were being abandoned. It was obvious that there was no religion going on. They didn't support the old gods of Rome, but they didn't support the new gods that were coming in from all over the Roman Empire either. They were also accused of being disloyal people because they wouldn't burn incense to the emperors. They wouldn't join in emperor worship. And they wouldn't make sacrifices on the altar of the goddess Roma, who represented the genius of Rome. In fact, their great slogan seemed to be "Jesus is Lord," and that's enough to worry any emperor, isn't it, who thinks he's the sole Lord. So they were accused of being atheists, they were accused of being disloyal, and Christian slaves chattered about their theology, and gradually other slaves were drawn into their circles as well. That was considered subversive. The idea of slaves organising anywhere filled a respectable Roman with fear. They had secret meetings, only because they had to, but the very fact that they had secret meetings was suspicious, and they talked about drinking the blood and eating the flesh of Jesus. So accusations of cannibalism were flying around. And they didn't like the idea of a secret society outside the control of the authorities, which is what Christians look like. Even worse, unwanted babies. The Romans had a practice of leaving to die any baby that was surplus to the needs of the family. And what do you know, they leave a baby out to die in the good old traditional Roman way, and these Christians come and take it away. What are they doing with all our babies? Well, they were raising them as human beings made in the image of God. But you can imagine how many stories went around about what Christians did with those poor babies. Now, there's a myth that the Emperor Constantine, after 300 years of this, decided to turn around and make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That's not true exactly. What really happened was he just went with the trend. He made Christianity a permitted religion, and he did something terrible to us. He made us respectable. And Christianity has suffered ever since from being respectable. But he was just riding a trend. He knew that the old politics and the old religions were dying, and although the Christians were a minority, they were an influential minority. They were winning the arguments at the philosophical level. But they were also bringing hope and self-respect to millions of people, citizens and slaves. They really were progressing the Roman society, whether Roman rulers liked it or not. Now that whole historical lesson tells us something important. We don't have to tie ourselves to progressive politicians if we want to progress God's kingdom. We don't have to play the political game. I believe that the contrast between, shall we say, conservative and progressive politics is largely bogus. I think all kinds of wickedness hide behind those labels, and I don't believe in either of them. This week, the USA is being torn apart, and the conservative versus progressive conversation is not helping. Even the overblown resentments of the Brexit debate of a few years ago saw people breaking into tribes that were not helpful. And I'll be honest with you, even when politically minded Christians start posturing, it makes me feel queasy. Now, when I talk like this, I think many people think I'm being a bit anti-politics, anti-progress, anti-everything. But actually I think we need to set ourselves free from all of the political games, from the techniques and the apparatus of modern politics. I'm really fed up with Christians who try to keep raising awareness by wearing the right coloured ribbons, poppies, badges, whatever. They're always looking for a chance to either wear their hearts on their sleeves or possibly nail their colours to the mast. I'm irritated by people who seem to think they know what to think about every subject, however complex. These are the people who are the consumers and the creators of political propaganda. They used to read their approved newspapers in the old days, didn't they? They knew which papers were correct and they read them pretty much cover to cover. But only the proper papers, depending on what particular political tribe you belonged to. Now, of course, they follow the right people on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever other weapon of instant propaganda they prefer. They don't even have to write to the Telegraph anymore or write to the Guardian anymore. They just have to post a few lines tapped out on a keyboard to get that nice little buzz of knowing they're in the right. No, I'm not asking anyone to get involved in that game. I'm just reminding us, what did the early churches do? Well, they did none of that. They were completely excluded from the political game. In those days, to play that game, you needed money or soldiers, and they didn't have any of that. They didn't have the opportunity, but also by conviction. They believed that the politics of their day was so sinful and so wrong and so corrupt, they didn't want to take the mark of the beast by being involved in it at all. So what did they do? They testified. They testified to God and His grace. Intellectually, I am depressed by the lack of intellectual depth in modern Christianity. I don't have time to go into it, but I've basically stopped browsing Christian bookstores because I find it so depressing. So, how did they testify? Well, they did have great minds. People like Tertullian, Origen, and many others, some of whom I think were spectacularly wrong on some things, but my goodness, they won the argument. But personally, you didn't have to be an intellectual giant to testify. What they did was they thoroughly trained their converts in Christian theology, in Catholic doctrines, as they called it. The word Catholic being based on a Greek phrase, kataholis ikoumene, which means throughout or from the whole household. And by that, meant that they were trying to stick to the one faith delivered once and for all by the apostles, which was believed throughout the Christian church, from Carthage to Chester, from Spain to Persia. Christians tried very hard to make sure that they were getting the same milk of the word, the same truth that everyone else was getting. And they didn't go on evangelism training courses. They didn't buy books on how to share your faith. But they did have catechisms, which unfortunately we don't have now. They're all lost. The only catechisms we have come from the next period of time. But they were trained. There was a massive effort to train people in the apostolic faith. But most of all, apart from their training in Catholic doctrine, they walked with God. And I think that's the secret weapon. They walked with God. It helped that they were despised and disadvantaged. That's always a help if you want to stay true to Jesus. That meant no one joined the church to gain an advantage. It was disadvantageous to be a Christian. And that helps. There was no salesmanship in the early church because there was nothing to sell. But they changed the world. You could say they changed the world without even trying to. They progressed things. Now, they spoke about Jesus a lot. They were notorious for being chatty. But they didn't do that because their pastors told them they had to be good witnesses. They spoke about the things that were important to them. Everyone does that. You can soon find out what people care about by listening to their conversation. When I listen to some Christians, I realise what they really care about is house prices or their next holiday. But when you spoke to these people, Christ was on their lips. Now I've done a little sort of hagiographic praise session today on the early church and the Christianity of the first 300 years. But I want to say that they were, for all their problems, a lot more optimistic than we privileged Christians are. They saw progress, but they didn't see political progress as we understand it. It's something for you to think about this sunny summer day. Bye for now.